following podcast is provided by CarePartners Living and Answers for Elders Radio.
And welcome back, everyone, to Answers for Elders Radio Network. And I'm here with the Executive Director of the Cottages of Renton. And Cottages of Renton is a dementia and Alzheimer's community that honors our seniors and absolutely just has this amazing concept. And I've talked a lot about the cottages and why they do what they do and why they are built the way they are. I am so honored to have Forrest Stepnowski, the executive director. So Forrest, welcome back to Answers for Elders.
Hello again.
So you talked in our first segment, for those of you that are catching, please go back to segment 1, but you talked about speaking their language is something that was really kind of triggered in my head. Tell us a little bit about what does that mean?
When I refer to people, when I refer to the concept of speaking their language, I'm looking at a more global thing. Behaviors are communication.
Right.
9 times out of 10, it's a sign of an unmet need. Not always a rational need sometimes, but
right.
It's still a need the resident feels or the person who has dementia feels they have. So we need to find out what that causes. What is that trigger? What is their want? What is their desire? Just because someone has dementia, people sometimes forget that the person isn't still there until the very end. They are. What are their hobbies? What activities can we provide them? What food are they craving? All these things are part of their communication. Are they having pain?
Yeah.
How does that present? How is that grimacing? Is it just a facial grimace? Are they becoming irritable and pacing because they hurt? All of those play a role in learning how to speak their language, because everyone with dementia, yes, it's easy to say there's stages to the progression of that disease process.
Right.
But they're not clear. And that's one thing I want to remind people is dementia affects people differently. Yes, we can go by the books definitions of stages all we want. And I've been working in this field for about 32 years now. I mean, I started really young. My mom was a retired assistant director of nursing. I kind of grew up in the nursing homes. So that's where my passion for this came from.
Of course.
And it's like learning how to see each person's what their little tick is, what is causing them to become irritable all of a sudden when they're focused on something all of a sudden. You mentioned earlier about your mom having some paranoid moments with people lurking out.
Absolutely.
Who did she believe they were?
Yeah.
So we have to open up the umbrella a little bit wider, and we have to be willing to put ourselves where they are. Understand what they are trying to communicate.
And I think one of the things you hit on, and I'm so, one of my biggest frustrations, and I have to tell you, is the healthcare community. We have physicians all over the place, and I would take my mother to a doctor appointment, and the doctor would talk to me about her rather than acknowledging that she was in the room. And that I finally lost it with a doctor one day. I said, talk to her. It's not like she can't, maybe she's a little slower to process, but this is still her life. And it's sad that we've seen this often with people that should understand what you're saying. They don't. How do you think why is that?
I actually think that's learned behavior. Sometimes over time, especially for those of us who've worked in this industry as long as we have. Sometimes there's this learned loss of empathy. Honestly, COVID did that to many people who work in the healthcare industry. They have lost that ability to have empathy for the people that they're taking care of, and they're working through the motions.
Right.
So there's that part. But sometimes we have to remind the providers that we work with that is still a human being there. They still may not remember what you're telling them 10 minutes later, but they deserve to know now at that moment, at the present.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I had to learn as her caregiver is they would say, like, if mom was there for a pain, maybe her back was hurt or whatever, they would ask her questions like, where is the pain between 1 and 10? She didn't have any capacity.
And they won't. Yeah.
And it was always a 4. And it was like, Mom, you're in excruciating pain. But then I learned, don't correct her, in front of her. So I had to learn my own way of communicating with healthcare people. I know I always talk about the white envelope, is to put my concerns in a white envelope. And when we check in from the doctor, give that to the doctor in advance so I can keep my mouth shut and be her daughter and let the doctor figure it out. Those are things I think if we were a little bit more mindful as family members, and as that, to remember that their reality is their reality. And
Right.
that's the real thing, right?
And that's exactly what I mean by, if they say it's 1945, it's
Exactly.
1945.
Exactly.
And maybe it is a 4 to her because of maybe some aphasic language stuff that's going on for her. Maybe she's meaning 10. So what does she really mean when she says 4?
Right.
That's where the provider needs to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And trust the families. The way you communicate with the provider, I'm very proud of you. A lot of families I've dealt with in the past, like the hospital doesn't understand this. They're aging my loved one, saying, "Oh my God, they'll never recover from a broken hip because they're 92 and they have dementia."
Right.
And it's like, well, they don't know your parent,
True.
because everyone is different. I have taken care of people up until 108 years old before, and that was when early on in my career. I reminded her of one of her great grandchildren, and she used to, if someone else tried to come take care of her, 108 years old, she could still stand.
Yep.
And she got, come on. And she was like, okay, no, here I am. Hi, Grandma. Hi.
Exactly.
I was her grandson. I could never correct her. To the point that the nurses actually had to identify that she sees this CNA as her grandson.
Yeah.
So we actually care planned that, and that worked. And we were able to get to the point where, because we're speaking her language, I identified with her. I hired this caregiver special for you to take care of you today and pamper you. Oh, all right. I'll take that. I mean, we really had to play with that. She lived, I'll be 109, and she was.
That is amazing.
Very, very. So yeah, people
now
can't just cover the number. They can't.
You talked also in our first segment about trauma.
Yeah.
And how trauma affects behavior.
It does.
Could you elaborate on that?
So, whether people choose to admit it, trauma, like we used to treat dementia, is a invisible diagnosis that no one wants to talk about. Even if we ourselves have exhibited or experienced something traumatic in their lives, and that can be very, very scary for us to bring up sometimes. We forget that our memories come back, and people are getting hit by these memories of traumatic events to the point where it could be child abuse, dare I say rape, sexual trauma. All those things come back as dementia progresses itself.
Sure.
And that is something that people forget about, because again, just like we used to hide grandma and grandpa in the attic or basement, we used to hide those memories too.
Yeah.
When you see somebody who has dementia and you start seeing them layer up and they're being paranoid and they're being guarded, we have to look at that. That's part of
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when we discover that piece, we're able to treat better. We're able to provide better care and understanding of why.
Right.
Able to speak their language and help them with their care more effectively. All those things play a role.
Yeah. And I know that there's some wild statistics about PTSD. You've talked about that before. What again is that whole statistic about PTSD?
So in Washington state, it's estimated that 80% of our population has suffered a trauma of some sort.
Not
Yet
surprised.
PTSD is one of the number one hidden diagnoses or least diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Different populations in the 80s and 70s, um, women especially, were misdiagnosed as bipolar versus PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Be fair, in the 80s, they didn't even know what PTSD was. Everyone's always had that identified to people who were soldiers, especially people who were coming
Sure.
from Vietnam and stuff like that. But a trauma response is a trauma response. A
Mm-hmm.
trauma
Mm-hmm.
history is a trauma history.
Yeah. And obviously to recognize what that is, oftentimes families don't even know what those traumas are if things happen to them in childhood. And especially with our older adults, oftentimes, we don't talk about the uncomfortable things. We don't deal with things. There was things I learned about my grandmother from, the early 1900s that I had no idea until after she was dead, until other family members told us. So those are things I think that we all need to be mindful of the fact that, 80% of us have had a trauma in our lives. And that's overwhelming to think about. I've also know it's just the most highest, this is another thing, elder abuse, the most common person or people that cause elder abuse aren't providers, they are family members. And that's a whole other story that, especially with those that have dementia, that can be a huge situation.
Absolutely. And it goes from ranges of physical neglect, physical
Financial.
abuse, as well as financial exploitation. And I've
Yeah.
seen it many times in my life,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Verbal
where
abuse. And it's just, I'm not discounting the frustration that families have. But the point of the matter being is that to keep, a senior that is in that reality, that's not going to change.
no.
They need to be in a community or a place where that tension can be lifted. And I think that's one of the things that, I am such a strong proponent of memory care, such as yourself, just for that reason, because the average individual, they don't understand how to speak that language.
They
and
don't.
when they lose it because but you can't lose it with that individual. Go for a walk, go do things, but you have to realize that
Right.
sometimes you feel like you're stuck.
And then there's also the stats, with people who are caregiving for their loved one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge statistic that shows that the person who decompensates faster is actually the caregiver
Mm-hmm.
in the relationship versus the caregiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sometimes having to place your loved one in a place like here at the Cottages in Renton is a form of self-care for yourself as
Right.
well.
Right.
And
Right.
that's important for you too. It's like you have to be able to make sure you're keeping that balance as well.
Right. Well, Forrest, this has been such a powerful conversation, and I would love to continue your expertise in future podcasts talking about dementia. I think it's a very timely and important topic, and especially coming from you, we would be truly honored to have you.
I'll be glad to do so. Thank you for having me.
And thank you. And for all of you, remember, Forrest is the executive director of the Cottages of Renton, which is a memory care, beautiful community. And also, if you're interested in any care partner community, they have communities all the way from in Washington State, Puget Sound, all the way far north is Blaine, and all the way far south is Lacey, including Bremerton, part of the peninsula, and Arizona. So you've got 2 communities in Arizona, right? Now?
We have 3 now, I
3
believe.
now. Okay, I knew that but you had 1 under construction. So that's amazing.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And then we have 2 in Spokane as well.
Yes, you do. I forgot about Spokane. So, and obviously there's a Cottages in Spokane. So those of you interested, check out carepartnersliving.com. And Forrest, thanks again for being on the show.
You too. Thank you for having me.
The preceding podcast was provided by CarePartners Living and Answers for Elders Radio. To contact CarePartners Living, go to carepartnersliving.com.